Hi everyone, my name is Frank Godinez, and today I'll be presenting my project titled Public Schooling in South Central, Race, Divestment, and the Carceral Classroom, a paper project that I completed during the fall quarter of 2023 for Dr. Chris Herring's Soc 151 Urban Sociology class. So the project is divided into the following 6 categories, and I'll go straight into an introduction. As mentioned, my name is Frank Godinez, and I'm born and raised in South Central, as well as an LAUSD alum. So this is both a passion project, but also very close and dear to my positionality. I'm also a third-year undergraduate in sociology and political science, and Mellon Mays and Bunch Research Fellow, whose research interests include critical theory, political economy, and carceral studies. So between the years of 2014 and 2017, the Los Angeles School Police Department made 3,389 arrests while issuing 2,724 citations and 1,282 diversions. Youth of color comprised 76% of all of these encounters, with Black students alone representing 25% of all encounters, despite making up only 8% of the LA Unified population. Uncoincidentally, the school district locales in which these numbers were most disproportionate happened to be those located closer to the inner city of South Central Los Angeles. Scholars have explored the implications of racialized youth criminalization, paying specific attention to depressed inner cities as sites of hyperpolicing. Urban sociologist Louis Waquan is among those who have studied the construction of ghettos and hyperghettos, as well as the carcerality of the urban as a socio-spatial phenomenon. The task of this paper is to unpack the criminalization of Black and Brown students in South Central public schools as a racialized byproduct of urban capitalist development. Using Damien Sojourner's conception of cultural and ideological enclosures in Los Angeles public schools, I argue that schools in South Central function as an appendage of the prison by socializing students of color to preserve neoliberal capitalist development. So within the larger melting pot that is Los Angeles, South Central has historically been ethnically segregated and disinvested from. Initially, racial segregation, in other words, restrictive covenants, sufficed as the instrument by which Black and Latino people were systematically excluded from white residential neighborhoods. But it only took a few decades in the post-war period for racial segregation to sediment into persisting access restrictions to housing mortgages, union jobs, and quality social services. These same racial disparities in the workforce and housing market throughout the early 20th century also characterized the post-war suburbanization process, with less than 2% of non-whites in some areas receiving access to the tens of billions that went to housing development. Suburbanization was essentially a project of constructing whiteness at the expense of the suburban ghetto that continued to grow with Blacks and Latinos. Where Black and Latinos' housing opportunities in the suburban skirts of the urban ghetto did exist, they often bore the brunt of predatory loaning, regimes that laid the framework for their waning home values. Consequently, as the process of deindustrialization exported mainly low-skilled manufacturing jobs to growingly autonomous suburban communities or overseas, urban local economies were left in a precarious position of housing, job, and social insecurity. In tandem with the Federal Highway Act of 1956, more affluent commuters could conduct business in the urban ghetto without having to contribute to the local tax base. Public schooling infrastructure, by virtue of being funded by local property taxes until 1978, tended to be both segregated and underfunded in the urban ghetto. It is precisely within this context of state retrenchment and the state-sanctioned dissolution of local tax bases that we should situate our understanding of public schools in LA. As South Central transformed from a ghetto to a hyper ghetto throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, large influxes of Latinos from Mexico and Central America shaped its demographic transition from a historically Black to a shared Black and Brown space. Sociologists Pierrette Sotelo and Manuel Pastor trace how Black and Brown syncretism paved the path for the cultivation of a place-based racial identity among Black and Latino community members. This theme of Black and Brown unity is underpinned by the shared experiences of hyperpolicing, gang violence, and havoc wreaked by the crack epidemic, which criminalized its people of color and stigmatized it as a place. Over time, the population of Latino youth in South Central would rise from 63,000 in 1980 to 172,000 in 2016, in comparison to the count of Black youth dropping from 142,000 to 48,000 within the same time period, a demographic transition that carried over into schools as well. Although youth criminalization is not a focus of their book, it provides the context necessary for understanding South Central as an urban, racialized space and site of varying forms of state violence and organized abandonment. In the public school, legacies of disinvestment and technologies of violence against Black and Brown students continue to fester like a sore. Anthropologist Damien Sojourner's book, First Strike, provides an ethnographic account of public schooling in LA. Sojourner criticizes the school to prison pipeline for focusing too heavily on hard forms of punishment within the school. In other words, arrests, suspensions, metal detectors, surveillance, and analyzes the mechanisms by which schools in the urban context inflict harm on students of color every day. When unpacking the poor performance and truancy of Black students, Sojourner writes, it would be logical to understand that the self-removal of Black students from the formal educative setting is in order to protect their sanity. He was merely reciprocating the level of respect that the school had extended him. Where the role of Black culture in the struggle for Black liberation is immeasurable, public schooling denies the dignity of Black and Brown students by omitting analyses of the non-white cultural experience from school curriculum. Students' poor achievement is not due to intellectual deficiencies, but rather a rejection of schooling as a neoliberal project to trump Black and Indigenous resistance struggles with colonial narratives. Public schooling that lacks a racial discussion, therefore, should be viewed critically insofar that the school is an institution that disseminates and legitimizes the white or the dominant cultural values and views of how society should be organized. When these conceptions of how subjects should be taught or what should be taught are rejected, schools enforce disciplinary practices to punish dissenting or nonconformist groups. Students of color are taught to understand their schooling and material conditions as objective and divorced from sociopolitical and economic forces that mold their school experience. But this cannot be any further from the truth when their crumbling facilities, underfunded arts programs, and treatment as tokens or hooligans are byproducts of larger racial capitalist state inactions at play. So understanding South Central as an urban ghetto is necessary precursor to understanding the complicit role of its public schools in perpetuating a carceral continuum, both in the soft enclosures it imposes and the school to prison pipeline hard policies it uses to enforce the former. We should note that many schools in the urban city replicate the same carceral technologies of the hyper-ghetto. Projects have been fenced up, placed under beefed up security patrols and authoritarian controls. Random searches, metal detectors, it's as if though the children in here are being prepared for incarceration. The hyperghetto represents the sociospatial result of racial exclusion, state retrenchment, and the rise of the informal or illegal economy in the latter half of the 20th century. As such, it reflects a deeper system of quarantining a polluting group from the urban body in its racial manifestations of segregation, divestment, and criminalization, which came as a result of declining local economies and access to sustainable work opportunities. But by purging the hyperghetto's youth who fought victims to self-fulfilling prophecy of failing in school to being funneled into the prison, we fail to repeal the harm of racial capitalism. Racial capitalism, I argue, is the underlying thread in the carceral school and prisonization of the urban ghetto. This framework underscores the institutionalization of race as a social construct and subjugation of non-whites into pools of exploitable labor. In historical materialist terms, racial capitalism describes the evolving system of capitalism that uses Black and Indigenous labor as capital, extracting its labor power and accumulating the wealth produced. Hence, great migration and segregation trends seen in the Black and Latino experience. Public schooling, as we know it, ought to reckon with this history and disband technologies of soft and hard punishment if it is to be decarceral. So public schools in South Central have become a carceral institution of social control and socialization to dogmatic misunderstandings of self and schooling. Black and Latino youth have bore the brunt of these disinvestment and punishment mechanisms, especially as South Central represents an urban site of racial segregation trends shaped by pre and post-war labor trends. The cultural enclosures and hard School discipline tactics that were imported from the criminalized ghetto must be abolished if public schooling should become divorced from the carceral continuum. Only then will these schools begin to prioritize human development over capitalist development. So with that, I'll go ahead and conclude my project. Thank you so much for listening. I've included a couple other bodies of literature on carcerality in case you're interested, as well as my contact information. Thank you so much and goodbye.